Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to get into a concept that, according to our source material, is maybe the single most important trait for developing excellent judgment.
Yeah, it's this quality that helps you navigate all the really messy parts of life. We're talking career moves, relationships, even, big medical decisions without fooling yourself.
And we are diving deep into what the author, Julia Galef, calls the scout mindset.
It sounds simple on the surface, but really digging into why it's so rare and then how to actually start thinking that way, well, it's a total game changer.
So what is it at its core?
The core idea of a scout is this. It's the motivation to see things as they actually are, not as you wish they were.
Exactly. And that motivation, that's the one thing that allows you to recognize when you're wrong, to actively go looking for your own blind spots and to, really test your deepest assumptions.
Which is so important because, let's be honest, for a while there, the popular psychology books of the 2000s and 2010s, they painted a pretty grim picture.
Oh, yeah. The idea that we're all just hardwired for self-deception and rationalization.
Right, and that picture isn't completely wrong, but it feels incomplete, maybe a little too fatalistic. We're absolutely capable of that kind of rationalization. That's a soldier, but we can also resist it, and that's the scout.
We can choose the motive.
We can. The physicist Richard Feynman said it best, something like, the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool.
To really get a feel for the difference between this default soldier mindset and the more cultivated scout mindset, we have to talk about one of the most famous historical examples of all this in action.
The Dreyfus Affair.
The Dreyfus Affair. It's just a master class in what the book calls directionally motivated reasoning.
It's a perfect, if tragic, illustration of how the soldier mindset just completely warps reality. So it's 1894, and a memo turns up in the French army suggesting secrets are being sold to Germany.
And the pressure's on. They need a bad guy, and they need one fast.
Immediately, suspicion falls on Captain Alfred Dreyfus. And it's no coincidence that he was the only Jewish member of the general staff. He was already seen as an outsider, already distrusted by his peers.
So the whole investigation was poisoned from the very beginning. Their thinking wasn't, okay, who's the spy?
No.
It was, can we find evidence that Dreyfus is the spy? They started looking at everything through this lens of credulity.
Yeah.
What's what Galef calls directionally motivated reasoning. You're not asking, is it true? You're asking, can I believe it? Or maybe even, must I believe it?
And that cognitive distortion was just relentless. I mean, if a rumor suggested he was guilty, they just accepted it, no questions asked.
But if anything contradicted that?
Oh, then the skepticism came out in full force. For example, a handwriting expert initially said Dreyfus's writing didn't match the memo.
Which should have stopped them in their tracks.
It should have. But they asked themselves, must I believe this? And well, they immediately found reasons not to. They rationalized that the expert, who was also Jewish, must have a conflict of interest, so they just dismissed his analysis.
And it gets worse. They search Dreyfus's home and find absolutely nothing. Zero incriminating evidence.
An objective mind would pause there. A scout would pause.
But the soldier just asks, can we still believe he's guilty? And, of course, the answer is yes. They just rationalize it away.
Their logic was, he probably got rid of the evidence before we got here. The very fact that there's no evidence just proves how cunning he is.
It's a completely self-sealing argument. You can't possibly prove it wrong.
And that is the soldier mindset in a nutshell. To the people inside it, it feels like they're being objective, patriotic even, but they're driven by a completely different motive. Confirming their bias, saving face for the army, trusting their tribe.
Right now, contrast all of that with Colonel Georges Picquart. He comes onto the scene a few years later.
And Picquart is not some radical. He's a conventional patriotic officer. He even held the same anti-Semitic views that were common at the time.
So he had every reason, every directional motive to be perfectly comfortable with Dreyfus's conviction.
He did, but there was a more urgent reality for him professionally. The leaks were still happening. The spy was still active.
So he starts investigating.
He does. He starts looking at new evidence, and he notices that the handwriting of a different suspect, a Major Esterhazy, is a perfect, identical match to the original memo that sent Dreyfus away.
And this is the moment. This inconvenient truth forces this shift in his mind.
Yes. He enters what the book calls accuracy-motivated reasoning. He becomes a scout. When he saw that irrefutable evidence pointing to Esterhazy, he didn't accept the convenient excuses his colleagues offered him.
Like what? What do they say?
They suggested that maybe Esterhazy had been trained to imitate Dreyfus's handwriting, a total rationalization.
But Picquart didn't buy it.
He couldn't. It was just too implausible. He was evaluating the idea through a different lens now. He was just asking, is it true?
And then the final nail in the coffin.
Right. He finally gets to see the secret, sealed file that was used to convict Dreyfus in the first place. He'd always been told it was damning.
And it was.
It was nothing, just speculation, no hard evidence at all. Pickhart's motivation had shifted to clarity, to accuracy, even though pursuing it meant he'd face immense resistance from his own army.
And he did, didn't he? They tried to ruin him.
They tried to arrest him, destroy his career, ship him overseas, hoping he'd die in combat, all because he pursued the truth against every instinct of self-preservation and institutional loyalty.
Pickhart's story just shows how your mindset is the absolute determining factor. Whether you're in soldier mode or scout mode, that's what determines your ability to make those critical judgment calls in your own life.
Yeah, things like, do I really need this medical test? Or is it time to cut my losses on this project? Or is this relationship actually going to get better?
So our mission in this deep dive is to really unpack why that soldier mindset is so powerful, so tenacious, why it's the default for most of us.
And then to provide some practical tools, all drawn from this research, that can help you move toward the scout mindset, even and especially when it's emotionally really uncomfortable.
Okay, so let's start there. Why is the soldier the tenacious default? I mean, if being a scout leads to better outcomes, why aren't we all just scouts all the time?
It's a great question. And the author brings up this idea of Chesterton's fence.
Which is?
The idea that before you advocate for changing something, you first have to understand why it's there in the first place. You don't tear down a fence until you know why it was put up.
So the soldier mindset must be serving some kind of purpose.
It's serving several powerful, immediate protective purposes. It's like a psychological defense system. The book breaks it down into 6 overlapping categories, all about protecting the soldier's inner world or their social standing.
Okay, what are they?
The big ones are comfort, self-esteem, morale, persuasion, image, and belonging.
Let's start with comfort and self-esteem. Those feel like the most, visceral ones.
They really are. Comfort is simply about avoiding unpleasant emotions. The perfect analogy is that internet cartoon of the dog in the burning room just sitting there saying, "This is fine."
Right. Total denial.
It's a beautiful picture of cognitive dissonance. It's easier to pretend the fire isn't there than to deal with the terrifying reality of it. In a real crisis, like a scary diagnosis or a sudden job loss, that denial can feel like a lifeline.
But it's a dangerous one.
Extremely. Because if you tell yourself everything is fine when it really isn't, that motivated reasoning just degrades the very judgment you need to manage the situation, to make the tough calls. The soldier is always prioritizing feeling okay right now, often at the expense of dealing with reality later.
And then you have self-esteem. This is the drive to find flattering stories for unflattering facts.
The ego is so good at this. It's constantly moving the goalposts. I'm not wealthy not because I made bad decisions, but because I have too much integrity to succeed in a corrupt system.
Or in a social context, I don't have many friends, not because I'm difficult, but because I'm a superior solo flyer who doesn't need people.
Exactly. It reframes a potential failing as a strength. And there's research to back this up. One study showed that students who consistently got lower grades than they expected, well, by their senior year, they had started to conclude that, actually, grades aren't that important after all.
They protect the ego from the painful conclusion that they were, in fact, underperforming.
Precisely. And the book points out a really interesting nuance here between self-enhancement, which is believing you're brilliant, and self-protection, which is just avoiding blows to the ego.
And self-protection can sometimes lead to this weird, almost opposite effect.
It can. It's called masochistic epistemology.
That sounds intense.
It just means believing that whatever hurts must be true. It's a cynical, preemptive strike against your own ego.
How does that work?
Well, if you just assume the worst about yourself, that you're definitely going to fail the test, that everyone thinks you're an idiot, that you lack any real skill, then you inoculate yourself against the painful surprise of failure if and when it actually happens.
So you'd rather be miserably right than hopefully wrong.
You feel safer assuming the worst. It's another way the soldier prioritizes emotional stability over an objective assessment of reality.
Okay, so that's comfort and self-esteem. The third function you mentioned was morale.
Right. The soldier mindset can provide that shot of optimism you need to take action. Sometimes when you're facing something that's just overwhelmingly difficult, like starting a company from scratch or fighting a serious illness,
You almost have to delude yourself a little bit.
you do. Choosing to have faith in your success, even when the odds are stacked against you, can be the only way to summon the sheer willpower you need to even try. The soldier supplies that illusion of certainty that helps you overcome inertia.
Fourth on the list was persuasion.
Yeah, this one is fascinating. The idea is that conviction is convincing. If you genuinely, truly believe in your product or your political candidate or your own story, you are a much more effective advocate.
The example with the law students really illustrates this.
It does. They took students, randomly assigned them to argue for either the plaintiff or the defendant in a moot court case, and what happened?
They quickly came to believe that their side was the one that was morally and legally in the right.
They convince themselves first so they can better convince the judges. Lobbyists do it, salespeople do it. We convince ourselves that the claims we want others to believe are true, and that removes the conscious burden of lying. It just feels more authentic.
Which brings us to number 5,
Yep.
image, or impression management.
We choose beliefs that signal something desirable about ourselves. I might adopt a moderate political stance to signal that I'm mature and reasonable, or I might adopt a radical one to signal that I'm courageous and principled.
It's about looking good, and often that means finding a defensible, noble-sounding explanation for what might be a pretty selfish behavior.
This is classic signaling theory. You use socially acceptable justifications to mask your self-interest. Like, if a new housing development is proposed, that would lower your property value.
You don't stand up at the town hall meeting and say, I'm worried about my property value.
Of course not. You say, I'm deeply concerned about the long-term impact on the local environment and the strain on our water table. It's a defensible, morally superior explanation that cultivates a positive image, whatever your private motivation might be.
And that leads to the last one, and maybe the most powerful, belonging.
This is about tribalism, loyalty, social cohesion. The beliefs of our group are incredibly powerful, and it's one thing to defer to a consensus because it's probably wise.
But it's another thing entirely when you actively protect yourself from finding the wrong answer.
Right. The example of Katja, the woman who grew up in an environmentalist town, is so telling. When she started finding logical arguments that actually supported logging companies, it made her feel physically sick.
Her soldier was protecting her sense of belonging to her tribe.
Because the potential cost of dissenting from the group of being cast out often feels much, much greater than the cost of just being wrong about some facts. The soldier's job is to protect our social standing above all else.
So the soldier is our default protector. It shields the ego, it helps us signal virtue, it keeps us in the tribe. But the big question the book poses is, does that convenience, that short-term comfort, outweigh the long-term cumulative cost of operating with a fundamentally flawed map of reality?
And that is the crucial tension. Some psychologists have argued that we are rationally irrational.
Meaning we choose just enough self-deception to get by socially and emotionally without doing too much damage to our judgment.
Exactly. But Galef argues that we are far, far from that optimal balance. We systematically misjudge the costs and the benefits of seeing the truth clearly.
Which brings us right to the cost of ignoring the truth. The book points out 2 major ways we get this trade-off wrong. The first is that we overvalue immediate short-term rewards.
We are just guided by the immediate payoff. We feel good now, and we fundamentally underestimate the compounding, cumulative harm of holding false beliefs.
Like the lie ripple effect.
Yes. A single small rationalization in the moment, to protect your ego after a mistake, it commits your future self to subsequent lies and rationalizations just to maintain consistency.
And that slowly warps your entire map of reality.
It does. It can even mean you end up lacking sympathy for other people's failures because your internal map insists, well, I never make mistakes like that. This cumulative harm is so hard to see in the moment, which makes the short-term comfort of the soldier seem so cheap.
The second bias is that we overestimate social costs.
Dramatically. We think other people are thinking about us and judging us way more than they actually are, and we think that judgment has a much bigger impact on our lives than it really does.
The statistic about patients withholding information from their doctors is just staggering. 81%.
It's a potentially life-threatening choice, and it's based on a social cost that is effectively zero. Your doctor's private opinion of your lifestyle has no real bearing on your life, but that fear of looking bad feels so much more significant than the potential medical consequences.
That fear can literally override our survival instincts.
Yeah.
You told the story of Mark Svenvold, the guy chasing tornadoes in Oklahoma.
He's in a motel, the tornado alarm is blaring, and he's paralyzed. He's hesitating to take cover.
Why?
Because the motel clerk and two local guys are just sitting there, drinking beer, looking totally nonchalant. He was frozen by the fear of looking like a fool, like an unschooled visitor in front of these strangers.
Wow.
The instinct to avoid social risk at all costs was literally overriding the existential threat of a massive tornado bearing down on him. It's a vivid illustration of how skewed our instincts are.
It's clear that we systematically choose the soldier. But soldiers often justify this by leaning on this popular idea that, positive illusions are necessary for mental health. The whole depressed people see the world more realistically trope.
And we have to debunk that myth because it's based on some really flawed research. For instance, a lot of it started with studies that found people with high self-esteem tend to rate themselves as better than average.
And the researchers just concluded this must be a bias.
They did, but they never actually checked if the subjects' ratings were accurate or not. I mean, why couldn't the conclusion just be people who are objectively better than average at certain things tend to have higher self-esteem? Assuming it was a bias without confirming the inaccuracy was a huge flaw.
And the way they measured self-deception was also deeply subjective, wasn't it?
Oh, completely. There was this infamous self-deception questionnaire from the 70s, and it determined that the happiest people were the ones who were lying to themselves more.
But how did it define lying?
Well, if you gave a low rating, like a 1 or 2 out of 7, to questions like, do you ever get angry? Or do you ever feel attracted to people of the same sex? You were automatically classified as self-deceiving.
So the researchers were just measuring against their own personal assumptions about what an honest person should admit to?
Exactly. It tells you a lot more about the researcher's biases than the subject's honesty. The whole body of research is suspect because of that flawed foundation.
So if we accept that self-deception isn't actually necessary for mental health, and that it systematically erodes our judgment, we have to find a different source of motivation.
And that's where the Scout excels, especially when it comes to choosing goals and deciding how much risk to take.
Because if you're delusionally overconfident, you stop asking the most important Scout question.
Which is this goal really worth pursuing compared to all the other things I could be doing with my life? You just get locked into a path without ever checking if it's the right one.
And an accurate picture of the odds helps you decide how much to stake on success. The example of the entrepreneur Norm Brodsky is just heartbreaking.
He had a secure, profitable company, but his soldier mindset convinced him he was invincible, that he couldn't fail in this new venture.
So he just kept pouring money from his good company into the failing one.
Until both of them collapsed. He realized, too late, that he had destroyed a perfectly good business because he exposed it to a level of risk it never should have faced. All because he wasn't willing to look at the real probability of failure.
This shows the huge difference between determination and delusion. The Scout's morale is actually more robust because it's rooted in truth.
Think about Jeff Bezos. He estimated Amazon's chance of success at about 30%. Or Elon Musk, who gave Tesla and SpaceX maybe a 10% chance.
They weren't motivated by some false certainty that they were going to succeed.
No. They were motivated by the concept of positive expected value. The calculation wasn't, I will definitely win. It was, this is a bet worth taking. The massive potential value of success outweighed the very high probability of failure. The Scout uses clarity to fuel high-impact risks.
Okay, this is a great place to pivot. Let's get into the practical side. How do we start developing a Scout mindset? The first step seems to be recognizing the false signals of objectivity.
Yes, this is so critical. We can't trust the feeling of being rational.
What do you mean?
We often feel calm and logical and dispassionate when we're thinking through our own arguments, and we assume that feeling means we are being objective.
But it's often just the soldier patting itself on the back.
Exactly. The book gives the example of the Redditor who, calmly and rationally, asked his girlfriend to give away her beloved cat before she moved in with him. His feeling of objectivity was completely disconnected from the reality of how selfish and unfair his demand was.
And what's worse, thinking you're a rational person can actually make you more vulnerable to bias.
Because you start to trust your own intuitions more. Look at the physicist Lawrence Krauss. He used his scientific identity as a weapon to dismiss accusations against a friend. He said something like, I judge things empirically, and therefore I believe my friend.
He's using the language of a scout to defend the gut feeling of a soldier.
Precisely. And speaking of intelligence, the book just demolishes the idea that a high IQ or deep expertise protects you from bias, especially on ideologically charged topics.
The research by Dan Kahan is really eye-opening here.
It is. He found that on issues like climate change, as people's science intelligence goes up, the political polarization doesn't shrink, it gets bigger.
They just get better at arguing for their side.
They become more effective soldiers. Their intelligence becomes a sophisticated tool to find evidence that supports their viewpoint, not a tool to converge on the truth.
So if feelings and intelligence aren't reliable signs of a scout, what is? What are the genuine signs?
The book argues you have to look at a person's track record of behavior.
Okay, like what?
First, a willingness to tell other people that they were right and you were wrong. The example of Abraham Lincoln writing to General Grant after the victory at Vicksburg is just incredible.
Lincoln had opposed Grant's strategy, right?
Strongly opposed it. And after Grant succeeded anyway, Lincoln wrote him a letter to make the personal acknowledgement that you were right and I was wrong. That takes enormous intellectual humility.
Okay, what's another sign?
Second, being genuinely comfortable with criticism. It's easy to say you welcome feedback, but a scout looks at their track record. Do you actively seek out critics? Have you ever actually changed your mind because of a critic?
Third, and this is a big one, actually trying to prove yourself wrong.
The journalist Bethany Brookshire did this. She had a viral tweet about a gender bias she perceived in email greetings. It was a very satisfying narrative.
But then she checked the data.
She went through her own inbox, analyzed the data, and realized her impression was just wrong. And then she published a follow-up admitting her mistake. She voluntarily fact-checked her own popular claim. That's a huge scout indicator.
Okay, what else?
Fourth, taking active precautions to avoid fooling yourself, like the Nobel laureate Saul Perlmutter. He was so worried about motivated reasoning creeping into his measurements of the universe's expansion.
He used blind data analysis.
He did. He had a program shift all the data by a random hidden amount, so his team did the analysis completely blind to what the real result was, which prevented them from nudging the numbers toward the answer they hoped to find.
And fifth,
having good critics. Charles Darwin was apparently furious with most of his critics who misrepresented his work, but he treasured a handful of good critics who actually understood his theory and offered intelligent objections. A scout seeks out the smartest people who disagree with them.
So how do we start noticing this bias in ourselves, in the moment? We need some tools.
We do. And the book offers a set of thought experiments designed to break what it calls the brain's forcing trick.
What's the forcing trick?
It's how our brain cleverly stops us from seeing the other side of an issue, the counterfactual. It ensures that only evidence that confirms our view comes to mind. It's why a Democrat and a Republican can look at the same politician's affair and have wildly different reactions.
Okay, so what are these thought experiments?
The first is the double standard test. You simply ask, am I judging others by a standard I wouldn't apply to myself, or vice versa?
This can be really powerful for dissolving resentment. The military student who was angry about being rejected by women realized through this test that he'd do the exact same thing in their position.
It works the other way, too. If you're beating yourself up for a small mistake, ask yourself if you'd judge a friend that harshly for the same thing. Usually, the answer is no.
The next one is the outsider test.
Here, you imagine an outsider taking over your life or your job with no emotional attachment to your past decisions. What would they do?
This is what Andy Grove at Intel did.
He and his executives asked, what would a new CEO do? And they realized a new CEO would immediately get Intel out of the memory chip business. It broke their emotional attachment to the past.
What's next?
The conformity test. You ask yourself, would I still believe this if the person or group who influenced me suddenly changed their mind?
This gets at how much of our belief is really our own versus just social consensus.
Exactly. And then there's the selective skeptic test. This one is tough. You have to imagine that the piece of evidence you're looking at actually supported the other side. Would you still find it credible?
So if you read an article trashing a politician you dislike, and it's full of cherry-picked anecdotes, you have to ask,
would I dismiss this exact same article as sloppy and biased if it were aimed at a politician I like? It forces you to apply your standards of evidence consistently.
And the last one.
The status quo bias test. We are all biased in favor of the way things are right now, so you have to ask, if my current situation was no longer the default, would I actively choose it?
Like the British blogger asking if we weren't already in the EU, would I vote to join it?
Yes. It forces you to evaluate your position on its merits, stripped of the comfortable default. These 5 tests are like a toolkit for forcing your brain out of its comfortable soldier-like ruts.
And that leads to the next big tool, moving beyond just thinking in black and white, yes or no, and actually quantifying your uncertainty.
Most of us treat certainty as this simple binary thing. You're either sure or you're not. A scout, on the other hand, treats certainty as a prediction of their likelihood of being right.
It's a concept called calibration.
Exactly. Perfect calibration means that when you say you're 90% sure of something, you are, in fact, correct 90% of the time.
And most of us are horribly uncalibrated.
Horribly. The book uses the hilarious example of Mr. Spock from Star Trek. He's the icon of logic, but he's a terrible forecaster.
How so?
When an analysis was done of his predictions, it turned out that when Spock says something is impossible, it actually happens about 83% of the time.
Wow.
And when he says something is more than 99.5% likely, it only happens 17% of the time. He's anti-calibrated. His confidence is an inverse indicator of reality.
So how do we get better?
You can use the equivalent bet test. You use imaginary bets to pin down how confident you really are. If you think you're, say, 80% sure of something, would you be willing to take a bet that pays out $4 if you're right and costs you $1 if you're wrong?
If you hesitate, you're probably not really 80% confident.
Right. It forces you to be honest with yourself and put a real number on your uncertainty. It's a foundational skill for moving toward what the book calls intellectual honor as a life strategy.
Okay, so this is where it all comes together. Adopting intellectual honor as a core strategy means changing your relationship with being wrong.
Yes. You stop seeing it as a mistake and you start seeing it as an update.
And the super forecasters are the model for this. They're great at being right because they are constantly being a little bit wrong.
They change their minds all the time, but in small, incremental ways. One forecaster, Tim Minto, would revise a single forecast dozens of times as new information trickled in.
He's just course correcting.
He's just course correcting. And that incremental approach makes it so much less painful to encounter contradictory evidence. You're not admitting some catastrophic failure of your worldview. You're just nudging your confidence down from, say, 80% to 70%. It's a low-stakes adjustment.
And every time you realize you were wrong, it's a chance to get smarter.
Absolutely. The forecaster, Bill Flack, after he wrongly predicted a Japanese politician's actions, he analyzed his error. And he realized his mistake was that he was answering the question, if I were the Prime Minister of Japan, what would I do?
Not what is this specific person likely to do?
And that realization became a new rule for him. Don't assume world leaders will act the way you would. Analyzing your errors is how you hone your technique.
This is reflected even in the language scouts use. They don't talk about admitting they were wrong.
They talk about updating. It's a direct reference to Bayesian statistics, where you update your probabilities as you get new evidence. It reframes the whole process.
It takes the ego out of it.
It takes the ego out of it. The CEO of Twitch, Emmett Shear, said he used to struggle with admitting errors, but then he started thinking of it as, oh, it's just an update. I learned a new thing. What's the big deal? It's routine. It's low-key.
The next piece of intellectual honor is learning to lean into confusion.
Right, to resist that soldier's urge to just explain away anything that doesn't fit your theory. The book uses the metaphor of the raccoon photograph.
Where you think you see a rock floating in midair.
Until your brain finally snaps into place and you realize you're looking at a reflection in the water. Anomalies, things that don't make sense, are clues. They're puzzles.
Soldiers commit what's called the de minimis error. They just minimize the inconsistency.
Governor Earl Warren did this during World War II. He was convinced Japanese Americans were plotting sabotage. So when no evidence of sabotage was ever found,
He took that as proof of how successful the conspiracy was.
he explained away the biggest anomaly to protect his theory. A scout does the opposite. An anomaly is an opportunity. For Charles Darwin, the peacock's tail made him feel physically sick because it seemed to contradict natural selection.
But he didn't ignore it.
He puzzled over it for years, and that intellectual anxiety eventually led him to discover a whole new concept, sexual selection. It was an option C he never would have found if he just explained the anomaly away.
And finally, the biggest hurdle for becoming a scout is rethinking identity.
Our beliefs get so tangled up with our sense of self, with our pride, with our tribe. And once a belief becomes part of your identity, your main goal is to defend it, not to find out if it's true.
So the strategy is to hold your identity lightly.
Treat it as a description, not as a flag you have to defend to the death. You can say, I'm a feminist, but I would abandon that label if I came to believe the movement was causing net harm. Your identity is contingent on the evidence.
Barry Goldwater, Mr. Republican, is a stunning example of this.
He held his Republican identity so lightly that he could publicly defend Democratic investigators, he could urge a Republican President Nixon to resign, and he could dismiss his own party's accusations against Bill Clinton. He let his perception of the truth override his partisanship every single time.
Holding your identity lightly is also what allows for high-impact action, which is often low-identity action.
This is so important. The story of the Treatment Action Group during the AIDS crisis is the perfect example. They started out as a protest group, doing high-identity things like wrapping a senator's house in a giant condom.
But they pivoted.
They pivoted completely. They abandoned the identity-affirming protests and started cooperating with the NIH. They learned the science, became citizen scientists, and helped design the clinical trials that ultimately reversed the AIDS tide. They relinquished their ideological purity to pursue actual impact, and it saved millions of lives.
So the ultimate reward then is when being a scout becomes its own identity.
Yes, you flip the script. The very things that used to be painful for the soldier become rewarding for the scout.
Like Joshua Harris, the pastor who wrote I Kissed Dating Goodbye. Years later, he changed his identity. He stepped down as a pastor and became a student with questions.
And that new identity made it possible for him to reevaluate his own work, to see its flaws, and ultimately to discontinue its publication.
And then there's Jerry Taylor, the former climate change skeptic. He talks about being in a debate where his position got shredded to pieces.
And his emotional reaction wasn't despair. It was, in his word, invigorating. It was like the satisfying soreness you feel after a really hard workout. His pride was no longer in being right. His pride was in being intellectually honorable. That sting became a feeling of growth.
This is the courage of intellectual honor. And it's shaped by the communities we choose.
Exactly. You have to seek out communities that reward accuracy over tribal loyalty.
And we can end with that incredible story of the elderly Oxford professor. He'd spent 15 years arguing against the existence of the Golgi apparatus.
And then a visiting scholar presents new, compelling evidence that it's real. And this old professor doesn't argue, he doesn't get defensive, he stands up and he applauds.
And he says, "My dear fellow, I wish to thank you. I have been wrong these 15 years.
That is the absolute peak of intellectual integrity.
And that really is the core takeaway here. You don't have to choose between being happy and successful on one hand and being realistic on the other. The soldier mindset is baked into us, but the goal is just incremental steps. It's not about overnight perfection.
And understanding that humans are, basically apes optimized for tribal defense, it makes you a little more forgiving of everyone's unreasonableness, including your own. The scout identity is just more robust. It leads to better decisions, better relationships, and fewer long-term failures.
So to leave you with a final thought to mull over, the next time you find yourself making a claim with total certainty, just pause. Ask yourself how sure you really are. Or try one of those thought experiments, like the status quo bias test, to expose your own assumptions.
That small act of intellectual honesty, when you repeat it over and over, that's how you start to build that scout identity for yourself.
Thanks for joining us. If you'd like to watch the mini explainer for this topic, click the link in the description and explore the full Critical Thinking Deep Dives playlist for more long-form episodes.